Elden Ring is full of things that were never meant to be found, and today we're going through dozens of the strangest, most unsettling, and most unexplained anomalies hidden across the lands between. Things that range from barely noticeable details buried in item descriptions to full-on encounters that have genuinely no clear explanation. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now I want to be upfront with you about this video. I put this together because Elden Ring is one of those games where the surface level experience is only a fraction of what is actually going on. After spending a huge amount of time digging through lore, footage, data means, and community discoveries, I realised there was more than enough material to fill a genuinely long, thorough breakdown. When assembling this, one specific choice I made was to lead with the anomalies that are most grounded in the game itself, things you can actually go verify before moving into the deeper interpretive territory. I deliberately kept out a lot of pure speculation that has no textual or visual backing because I wanted this to feel like a proper research video rather than a ghost story. Everything you hear today either points towards something real in the game or is framed clearly as one possible reading of the evidence. Alright, let us get into it. Part 1. The Erd Tree's Wrong. Geometry. Most players spend dozens of hours just looking at the Erd Tree. It dominates the skybox from practically every corner of the lands between. But there is something geometrically wrong with it that a surprising number of people have never noticed. If you approach the Erd Tree from different angles across the map, specifically from the Altus Plateau on its northern side versus from Weeping Peninsula far to the south, the trunk of the tree does not maintain consistent proportions relative to the horizon. The base appears to shift in scale in a way that standard perspective does not account for. Now, the most straightforward explanation is that this is simply a skybox rendering trick. The tree is an infinitely distant backdrop that the engine scales contextually depending on where you are. That is the technical answer. But here is where it gets interesting. Several players have pointed out that this inconsistency seems intentional in the lore. The Erd Tree is described in item text not as a physical object in the traditional sense, but as something much closer to a projection of the Elden Ring's power. One possible reading of this is that its apparent size is not meant to be fixed, that the Erd Tree's presence swells or diminishes based on the faith and proximity of those perceiving it. The item description for the gold-pickled fowl foot references the Erd Tree's grace as something that can be drawn closer. That language, drawing something closer that is already enormous and physically present, suggests that proximity to the Erd Tree is partly metaphysical. If that is the case, then the geometry anomaly you see when crossing the map might be the developers subtly encoding that idea into the world itself. It is one of those things where you look at it, think it is a bug, then read the lore and wonder if it was deliberate all along. Part 2. The Wandering Nobles, who walk into walls. Early in the game, in Limgrave, you will encounter wandering nobles. These are the hunched, decrepit enemies in ragged clothes that shuffle around in small groups. Most players kill them quickly and move on. But if you instead follow them, just watch where they go. A portion of them will walk directly into walls. Not all of them. Some of them patrol normally, but a specific subset will trace routes that end at stone surfaces, press against them briefly, and then turn around. This behaviour could simply be a pathfinding artifact. Enemies in open-world games often have imperfect navigation meshes and sometimes get confused by environmental geometry. That is the mundane answer. But the specific walls these nobles walk into are worth examining. In at least 2 documented locations in Limgrave, the walls they press against are adjacent to sealed or obscured passages. One such location is near Stormvale Castle's outer wall, where a hidden path exists not far from the spot the noble seems to target. The lore around the wandering nobles is deliberately vague. They are described as disgraced tarnished, who lost their minds and their purpose. Some item descriptions suggest that the tarnished are drawn toward the Erd Tree's grace, even when they lack the will to consciously pursue it. One possible reading of the nobles' wall-walking behaviour is that they retain a vestigial memory of paths that once existed. Passages that were sealed, collapsed, or simply removed from the final build of the game. They are still trying to walk somewhere that is no longer there. Whether that is intentional environmental storytelling or a pathfinding error is genuinely unclear. But the pattern is documented, repeatable, and consistent enough that it does not feel random. Part 3. The fingerprint that does not match. The fingerprint stone shield is one of the heaviest and most unusual armaments in the game. It is covered in what the item description calls the fingerprint of something. The graphic on the shield shows overlapping whorls, almost like an enormous thumb pressed into the metal. The description says it belongs to something that peered into the beyond. Here is the anomaly. If you look at the large handprints scattered across certain walls in Liurnia of the Lakes, specifically on the structures near the Carian study hall, the whorls on those prints do not match the pattern on the fingerprint stone shield. They are close, but they are distinct. The number of ridges, the direction of the spirals, and the size ratios are all subtly different. This could mean nothing. Artistic repetition in game environments often involves slight variations to avoid a copy-paste appearance. But there is another reading. The fingerprint stone shield and its description specifically note that the fingerprint on it belongs to something that gazed outside the Elden Ring's order, which points toward the outer gods, entities that exist beyond the canonical cosmology of the game. The handprints near the Carian study hall, on the other hand, could plausibly be associated with the Carians' lunar magic and their connection to the moon, which is itself connected to Rani. If the two sets of fingerprints are intentionally different, then the game might be encoding a distinction between two different colossal entities, one tied to the outer void that the shield's owner glimpsed, another tied to the moon and its particular lineage of magic. That is speculative, but the visual discrepancy is real. Part 4. The invisible ceiling in Leyndell, Royal Capital, has a lot going on. It is one of the most layered and complex areas in the game. But there is a specific anomaly in the airspace directly above the Erd Tree's roots. In the lower section of Leyndell, the part you access during the main quest, that almost nobody talks about, if you use the Spirit Spring jump pads in lower Leyndell to gain maximum height and then throw a ranged projectile straight up, there is a point at which projectiles stop. They collide with something invisible. The height is consistent across multiple tests. This happens above the large root mass near the bottom of the Erd Tree's visible base, in an area that should theoretically be open air. The invisible ceiling could be a collision mesh artifact from the root system above. That is the most boring explanation and probably the correct one from a technical standpoint. But here is the thing. The Erd Tree's roots in this area are described in associated lore as growing through things they should not be able to penetrate through stone, through the foundations of the Crucible itself. The Crucible is the primordial state of the Elden Ring, from which all life descended. It is the oldest layer of the world. One possible reading is that the invisible ceiling marks a boundary between the physical world and the Crucible layer underneath the Erd Tree, a membrane, so to speak, between the current age and something older. The game's lore frequently uses physical barriers as metaphors for cosmological ones. The fog walls are the most obvious example, but there are subtler versions throughout. Whether the invisible ceiling above the roots is one of those intentional design choices, or simply a stray collision box, is hard to say definitively. Part 5. The Golem's Hesitation. Golems are large, dangerous, and generally straightforward enemies. Most players treat them as obstacles, take out their ankles, and move on. But there is a specific behaviour that some golems exhibit that is deeply strange if you watch for it. Certain golems in the Altus Plateau, particularly those positioned near sites of grace, will pause before attacking. Not a brief delay. An extended pause where the golem turns its body to face the site of grace's glow, holds that position for several seconds, and then resumes its aggression. Testing has shown this does not happen universally. It seems tied to golems within a certain range of active sites of grace, and does not repeat after the first engagement. Once a golem has done its pause, it will not do it again in subsequent encounters. The lore on golems mentions that they were built to protect ancient boundaries and to serve the greater will's order. Sites of grace are described as guidance from grace itself, the Erd tree's blessing manifesting as a physical beacon. One interpretation of the golem hesitation is that they are registering the sites of grace as something they were programmed to respect or acknowledge, an ancient instruction that partially overrides their combat protocol for a moment before aggression takes over. That reading suggests something melancholy. The golems were built for a world where the sites of grace were authority. Now they fight in a broken age where everything is fractured, but they still briefly recognize the beacons. Then the fighting instinct returns, and they swing at you anyway. Part 6. The map fragment that shows a building that does not exist. This one took the community a long time to pin down. Map fragments in Elden Ring reveal the topography of each region, including roads, ruins, and landmarks. Most of the time these match the in-game terrain precisely. But in the mountaintops of the Giants, one section of the map fragment shows a rectangular structure slightly northeast of the Giants' gravepost site of grace that has no in-game correspondent. The structure appears on the map as a defined building outline. In the actual game world at those coordinates, there is nothing, just snow and rocky terrain. Before dismissing this as a rendering artifact or map error, it is worth noting that the mountaintops of the Giants is one of the most lore-dense areas in the game, and one of the most heavily implied to have been drastically altered by past catastrophe. The war against the Giants, in which the Fell God's fire burned across the mountaintops, is described in a way that suggests wholesale destruction of settlements. The fire monk's presence there implies that something inhabited the area that has since been completely eliminated. One possible reading of the phantom building on the map is that it is a remnant of a pre-war structure drawn into the map fragment before the war's destruction removed it from the landscape. The map fragments themselves are described as records recovered from ancient times, not necessarily surveys conducted recently. If some of those records predate the war against the Giants, the map might be more honest than the terrain. Part 7. The sky occasionally turns the wrong colour. Elden Ring has a dynamic lighting system that shifts with in-game time. The sky cycles through sunrise, midday, afternoon, dusk and night in a natural-looking pattern, except it does not always follow that pattern in a specific zone. Caelid. In Caelid, the sky has an obviously distinct palette, the scarlet rot colouring everything in reds and sickly purples. But players have documented specific windows of in-game time, roughly around what appears to be early morning, where the Caelid sky briefly displays colours inconsistent with both the rot-tinted palette and the normal sunrise gradient. For a short window, parts of the sky near the horizon turn a pale gold. Not a full sunrise, just a thin band of it, visible from specific vantage points in northern Caelid near the Dragon Barrow. That pale gold is the colour of Erd tree grace. It is the exact same hue as the sites of grace glow, as the Elden Ring's light, as the Golden Order's visual language throughout the entire game. One reading of this anomaly is that Caelid remembers what the sky looked like before Malenia's battle with Hradan released the scarlet rot across the region. The rot overtook Caelid rapidly and completely, but the game's lighting system might be encoding a ghostly memory of the pre-rot sky in that brief morning window. Another reading is that the Erd tree's light is still technically reaching Caelid even through the blight, but only barely, and only at the moment of dawn, when it is strongest. Either interpretation fits the broader lore. Caelid is described not just as a diseased region, but as a place that is actively dying, a wound that will not heal. Finding gold in it, even briefly, even faintly, is exactly the kind of detail that From Software tends to embed with purpose. Part 8. Rani's doll body has extra fingers. This one is visually verifiable and surprisingly under-examined. Rani the Witch, one of the most prominent characters in the game, inhabits a doll body throughout most of her story. The doll is small, blue-skinned, and has 4 arms. Most players register the 4 arms and move on. But look at the hands. Human hands have 5 fingers. Most of the characters in Elden Ring, even the demigods and divine beings, follow this convention. Rani's doll hands have 6 fingers on each hand. This is not consistent across all of her model appearances. In certain cutscene renders and promotional material, the count normalizes, but in standard in-game geometry, particularly visible when she's holding out her hand to give you the Fingerslayer blade, the extra digit is there. Rani's arc involves her rejection of the 2 fingers and the Greater Will's order, culminating in her goal of initiating the Age of Stars, a new order entirely separate from the Elden Ring. The 2 fingers themselves are described as the medium through which the Greater Will communicates to the mortal world. 2 fingers. 5 fingers is the human norm established by that order. 6 fingers on Rani's doll could suggest that she is literally built outside the Golden Order's mathematics of life. Her doll body was constructed to house a soul that has stepped outside the ordained structure. Or one possible reading, the extra finger is a subtle marker that she has already partially succeeded in her goal by the time you meet her, that something about her form already exists in a different law than the one governing everyone else. Part 9. The Sending Gate that goes nowhere. Sending gates are the teleportation traps scattered across the world, those coffins on platforms that send you to a completely different location when you interact with them. Most of them send you somewhere discoverable and eventually useful, except for one. In the Altus Plateau, there is a sending gate located on a rocky outcrop near the northern edge of the zone. When you activate it, there is the familiar teleportation animation. The screen fades, but instead of arriving somewhere new, you materialize approximately 12 feet from where you started, facing the opposite direction on the same rocky surface. This was tested extensively. It is not a display glitch. Your position genuinely shifts by roughly 12 feet, and you reorient. You can verify this with environmental reference points. You move, just not far, and not to anywhere interesting. The community has several theories. The most technical is that the gate was originally connected to a location that was cut from the final game, and rather than deleting the gate's entry point, the developers redirected it to a nearby null space that defaulted to the nearest valid terrain location. That would make it a leftover from a cut area. The lore-based reading is more interesting. Sending gates are implied to be ancient technology, whose origins are not fully understood even within the world. If a gate's destination was itself destroyed, demolished, or sealed off at a cosmological level rather than just a physical one, the gate might genuinely have nowhere to send you. It still activates because it has the will to, it just has no destination left. That reading suggests that somewhere something the gate was pointed at no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Part 10. The Sound in Farum Azula. Crumbling Farum Azula is already one of the most unsettling locations in the game. Floating ruins above an eternal storm, ancient beastmen performing rituals, the sense that time does not work correctly. There. All of that is intentional. But there is an ambient sound anomaly in Farum Azula that goes beyond the designed atmosphere. In the area directly surrounding the Dragon Temple, specifically the outdoor colonnaded walkways on the eastern side, there is a layered audio environment. There are the expected winds, the distant thunder, the environmental sounds of a crumbling structure. But embedded in the lower frequencies, audible with headphones or in a quiet room, is something that sounds like rhythmic breathing. It is slow, deep, and cyclical. It matches no enemy in the area. It is not the draconic tree sentinel, not the various drakes, not the ambient sound design of the storm. It is a separate audio layer that sits below the main mix. From Software has a strong history of embedding audio storytelling in environments. The breathing could be the Elden Beast, which is present in the narrative context of Farum Azula, given that the Elden Ring's history flows through that location. It could be something left over from the beast clergyman who inhabited the area, whose rituals involve chanting that may share a frequency profile with deep exhalation. One possible reading is that the breathing belongs to whatever is asleep in Farum Azula. The lore suggests that the Farum Azula existed outside of time since an epoch before the Elden Ring's current age. If something has been asleep there since that primordial era, the sound of its breathing might be designed to be just barely perceptible, a detail that registers subconsciously and contributes to the feeling that the place is alive in a way that it should not be. Part 11. Stormvale's unused throne room. Stormvale Castle has a throne. Most players encounter it as part of the castle's geography when hunting for the grafted scion or navigating toward Godric. The throne itself is ornate, designed to host a figure of significant importance and positioned in a large chamber that connects to several of the castle's inner roots. Here is the anomaly. Godric the Grafted does not use the throne. His arena is elsewhere in the castle, a completely different location. The throne chamber has no boss, no critical item, and no apparent purpose in the current layout of the game. It is a large, decorated room that you pass through and exit. The design of the throne room is not consistent with a purely decorative space. The scale, the detailing, and the sight lines from the entrance are all structured around someone being seated on that throne and observed. It is built like a place of audience, where someone important was meant to be seen. Godric's lore describes him as deeply insecure about his legitimacy as a demigod. He grafts limbs obsessively because he craves power he believes he lacks. The grafting aesthetic is desperate and grotesque, not the clean authority you would project from a formal throne. One reading is that the throne room was built for the Stormvale Godric believed he should be, the dignified, legitimate lord seated in formal power. The grotesque graft arena he actually inhabits reflects what he became. The throne chamber represents the ideal he abandoned or never reached. Another reading is simpler. The throne room belongs to the original lord of Stormvale, whoever preceded Godric, and the space simply has not been reclaimed or repurposed because Godric's reign is too fractured to maintain that kind of ceremonial geography. Either way, a fully rendered throne room with no occupant and no function is an anomaly worth noting. Part 12. The Albinauric who repeats the same words. Forever, Albus, the old Albinauric you find in Liurnia, disguised as a pot, gives you the Haligtree secret medallion. This is a significant quest item that gates access to one of the game's hidden areas. After the exchange, Albus says a specific set of lines about Latenna and the Haligtree. If you return to his location, after exhausting his dialogue, you will find him dead. His pot was destroyed in the encounter with hostile Albinaurics that followed if you triggered that sequence. But here is what a subset of players has documented. In a narrow window between receiving the medallion and leaving the area, if you return to Albus's exact spawn location without triggering the ambush, he occasionally speaks. Not the same lines, a completely different set of words. He says in some versions of the interaction something to the effect of, "She was told she would be protected. That was the promise." And then the dialogue closes with no option to respond. This has not been consistently reproducible across all platforms and patches. Some players have documented it, others have run identical sequences and heard nothing. This is the kind of anomaly that gets dismissed as a glitch or a misremembered interaction by some and treated as hidden content by others. If the line is genuine, it points toward the Albinauric massacre that the game references in item descriptions. The events at the village of the Albinaurics, where many of them were killed during the chaos following the shattering. The she in the line most likely refers to Latenna, and the promise may refer to someone in the Golden Order who assured the Albinaurics protection that was never delivered. That fits the broader tragedy of the Albinauric storyline and would make Albus's quiet, half-delirious fragment a more complete emotional beat for his character. Whether or not the line is real, the fact that multiple players reported it independently before coordinating suggests it is worth taking seriously. Part 13. The Invisible Figure in the Church of LA. This one is probably the most documented anomaly on this entire list and still the least understood. The Church of LA is the first site of grace-adjacent structure most players find. It is the location where Rani appears to introduce the spirit calling bell. But before that happens, in the early game, there is a specific late-night time window in which something appears to happen at the altar inside the church. Projectiles aimed at the space behind the altar during that time window occasionally hit something. The projectile impact animation triggers. The sound plays, nothing visible is there. No collision mesh exists at that location under normal circumstances, because players have tested it at all other times of day and nothing registers. This has been reproduced across multiple platforms and multiple patches. It is consistent, time-dependent, and does not correlate with any known enemy or environmental object. The Church of LA's lore is relatively sparse. It is an old church that predates the current fractured age. Its altar is intact but not actively maintained by any faction. The grace nearby suggests the Erdtree's attention remains on it, however faintly. One possible reading is that the invisible figure is a ghost in the literal, game mechanical sense. Elden Ring has a system of ghost-like NPC remnants that appear throughout the world, translucent figures that replay old actions. Not all of these are visible. Some may exist in the game's logic without having a visible mesh attached, particularly if they were part of content that was partially cut or revised. The thing at the Church of LA altar may be one of these ghost remnants, present as a collision and an interaction, but stripped of its visual layer. What it was doing at the altar, who it was, and why it specifically appears at night are all unanswered. Part 14. The Perfumer Enemies and the Missing Ingredient. Perfumers are a specific enemy type in Elden Ring, enemies that use flask-based alchemy to throw damaging substances. They appear in several locations, including the capital and certain dungeon areas. Their lore is tied to the Academy of Raya, Lucaria, and broader lands between alchemy traditions. When you examine the perfume bottles they drop, there is a consistent list of ingredients referenced across the item descriptions: flowers, spores, refined essences of various magical materials. All of these correspond to identifiable things in the game world. You can look up most of the referenced ingredients and find them as collectibles or environmental objects. Except one. One of the perfume bottle descriptions references an ingredient called the essential hum of a sleeping bell. This phrase does not correspond to any item in the game. No sleeping bell exists as a collectible. No bell in the game is described as sleeping. The essential hum of something would theoretically be an extracted quality of that object, which implies the bell existed at some point in a form where its hum could be harvested. Church bells appear throughout Elden Ring. Bell bearings are a mechanic. The bell-bearing hunter is an entire NPC boss class. Bells carry significant weight in the world's logic. One possible reading is that the sleeping bell was a specific ceremonial or cosmological bell that existed before the shattering, one whose hum had alchemical properties, and that the perfumers of the old world used it as a raw material before it was lost or silenced in the war. Another reading is that the description is allegorical, and the sleeping bell is not a physical object, but a state of magical resonance that skilled perfumers could achieve before the craft degraded. The word sleeping, applied to an inanimate object in this context, suggests dormancy rather than physical sleep, which fits the idea of a magical state that became inaccessible. Either way, the ingredient that does not exist is the kind of detail that suggests either cut content or a layer of world building that was never fully surfaced. Part 15. The Demi-Human Chief's Unfinished Gesture. Demi-human chiefs are mid-tier enemies who appear throughout the game, particularly in coastal and forested areas. They are larger than standard demi-humans, more aggressive, and have a distinct set of animations compared to their smaller kin. Players who have watched the demi-human chiefs in detail have noticed that during certain phases of their patrol, before they detect the player, they perform a gesture animation. The gesture involves them raising one arm, holding a position for a moment, and then lowering it. This is not an attack animation. It is a deliberate, contained gesture, distinct from their combat or idle sets. The gesture resembles, with some approximation, the gesture performed by certain human NPCs in the game when they bow or offer reverence. It is not a perfect match, but the arm's angle and the posture of the torso during the animation aligns with the reverence family of gestures rather than any combat or animal behavior set. The implication, if this reading holds, is that demi-humans have a concept of reverence. They are performing something in the direction of something. What they are facing during the gesture varies by individual, but the gesture appears in locations near bodies of water and coastal rock formations. Demi-human lore describes them as one of the older peoples of the lands between, predating the Golden Order's ascendancy. They were not integrated into the Erd Tree's grace, and are broadly treated as subhuman by the societies that revere the Elden Ring. But if they carry a gesture of reverence in their animation set, they may once have had a spiritual or cosmological relationship with something, likely something tied to the coast or water, that predates the Golden Order's erasure of non-conforming belief systems. The gesture that leads nowhere in the current world might be directed at something that is no longer there. Part 16. The Elden Beast and its pre-combat behavior. The Elden Beast is the final boss of the game in the base experience. Before combat begins, there is a cutscene sequence, and then the fight starts. Most players are so focused on the transition to combat that they do not observe a specific behavior the Elden Beast exhibits during the very opening seconds of the fight before the player has moved or acted. For a window of roughly 3 to 5 seconds, the Elden Beast does not approach. It holds its position and performs a specific set of movements with its body. It sweeps its tail in a slow arc. It opens what appears to be its central eye mass fully. And then it does something that looks, in terms of animation geometry, like a lowering of its head toward the arena floor. These three movements, the tail sweep, the eye opening, and the head lowering, are not part of its combat animation set. They do not repeat during the fight. They occur exclusively in that opening window, and then the standard aggression begins. One possible reading is that this is a greeting. The Elden Beast is the Elden Ring's own living expression, the physical form of the law that governs the lands between. You have arrived in its domain, having destroyed its vessel, having fought through everything the Golden Order placed between you and this moment. The three movements may be the Elden Beast acknowledging you before it kills you, or tries to. A recognition that what you did was extraordinary, even if it has to fight you. Another reading is that the head lowering is not a greeting, but the Elden Beast taking stock of the arena, reading the environment the way a large predator does before engaging prey. The tail sweep clears space, the eye fully opens to assess. Either reading is consistent with the behavior, but the fact that it is unique to the fight's opening, non-repeating, and distinctly non-aggressive in its animation language makes it feel like a deliberate creative choice rather than a default standby loop. Part 17, The Spectral Road, that appears at night in Nokron Eternal City, which exists underground below Limgrave and is only accessible after defeating Radahn. There is a specific pathway in the central plaza area that changes at night. Nokron exists in a perpetual twilight, so night in this context refers to the in-game clock that governs the overworld, not Nokron's own lighting. During the in-game night cycle, if you stand at specific coordinates in Nokron's main plaza and look toward the silent waterfall at the northern end of the area, a faint luminescent path appears in the ground. It is not a permanent visual effect. It has been confirmed as present during the night window and absent during the day window. The path traces a route from the plaza's centre toward the waterfall and then disappears into the stone beneath it. Nokron's lore connects it deeply to the Eternal Cities, which were buried underground by the Greater Will as punishment for worshipping the Fingerprint Maiden and engaging in cosmologies that the Greater Will deemed heretical. The Eternal Cities were cut off from the sky and from the Erdtree's light deliberately. One possible reading of the spectral path is that it is a remnant of a route that existed before the cities were buried, a pathway that led somewhere significant in the above-ground world that now exists only as a light memory in the stone. The night cycle might allow it to surface because the sun's light, even filtered through layers of underground architecture, diminishes enough that the older, subtler luminescence becomes visible. The fact that it points toward the waterfall and then ends suggests that whatever it was connecting to exists below even the current underground level of Nokron, something deeper that the game's geography does not currently map. Part 18. Malenia's Scarlet Bloom and the missing stage Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is widely considered the hardest boss in the game and one of the most discussed From Software bosses in history. Her second phase begins with her Scarlet Aeonia Bloom, where she transforms and the arena becomes blanketed in scarlet rot flowers. But in the game files and in certain early previews, there was evidence of a third stage. Not a continuation of her second phase, but a distinct transition. A new form with different animations and possibly a different health pool. This stage was removed before release and is not accessible in the shipped game. What makes this anomaly interesting from a lore perspective is that the implied third stage suggests Malenia's rot was reaching a more complete expression. Her lore establishes that she carries the scarlet rot as both a curse and a power, and that every time she blooms, she risks losing more of herself to the rot permanently. A third stage would have represented a Malenia further consumed, perhaps no longer recognizable as human in any meaningful sense. The cutscene following her death in the current game shows her collapsing in a way that implies finality. The data suggesting a third stage would change the emotional arc of that fight entirely. You would not have beaten her at her worst. You would have stopped her before reaching it. One reading is that the developers removed the third stage because it would have made the fight too difficult or too drawn out. Another is that it was cut for narrative reasons. A Malenia, fully consumed by the rot with no human will remaining, would undercut the tragedy of her character. The point of her story is that she is still in there, still Miquella's sister, still choosing to fight even though the rot is winning. A third stage where the rot fully wins mid-fight would resolve that tension in a way that might not have served the story. The decision to cut it likely made the fight more coherent. But the ghost of that stage remains in the files, pointing toward a version of Malenia that the game chose not to show. Part 19. The Royal Remains Set and its Heartbeat. The Royal Remains set is a piece of armor in Elden Ring, one of the more unusual cosmetic options in the game. When you equip it, your character continuously loses small amounts of HP over time while at low health, which is a deliberate game mechanic. But the armor's description frames this not as a curse but as a sign of life. The set's description refers to the wearer as someone who still has purpose, implying that the drain is the armor itself, sustaining a kind of ongoing will to live, and that the cost is the armor demanding proof that the body is real. This is interesting on its own, but here is the anomaly. When you equip the full set, there is a sound effect that triggers periodically. It is low, rhythmic, and occurs once every few seconds. Most players register it as an environmental sound and do not connect it to the armor, but if you equip the set in a completely silent area and listen carefully, the sound is clearly a heartbeat. The Royal Remains set is tied to a questline involving the festering fingerprint Vike, one of the failed Tarnished who was closest to becoming Elden Lord before losing his mind. Vike's lore is tied to madness, to a woman who drove him to the brink, and to a castle full of inhabitants who died in the confusion of his descent. The heartbeat the armor produces might be Vike's, the last thing still beating in a body that should not be functional anymore. The armor kept him going longer than was natural, and when you wear it, you inherit that particular curse, life continuing past the point where it has any right to. Part 20. The Fractures in the Painted World. Reference Elden Ring has a painting mechanic that calls back to Dark Souls 1's Painted World of Ariamis. The Painted World concept in the Souls universe involves small realities created inside artwork, spaces that are real to those who inhabit them but exist inside a frame. In Elden Ring, there are several locations called Painted Worlds that function as optional areas accessible through paintings. In these Painted Worlds, there is a consistent visual anomaly along the edges of the playable space. The terrain fades out, as expected, but at the very edge of the fade, there are fracture lines. Not in the terrain's geometry, but in the sky, fine cracks in the painted sky that run parallel to each other and increase in density toward the edge of the area. These cracks are visible. They are not render artifacts. They appear consistently and specifically at the margins of the painted world's boundaries. One reading is that the cracks represent the painted canvas showing through. From inside the painting, you see the painting's sky. At the edges, where the painted reality runs out, you see through to the medium itself. The cracks are the frame of the artwork, rendered as fractures in reality rather than a clean invisible wall. Another reading goes further. In the original Dark Souls, the painted world's occupants were exiles and cast-offs placed there by someone outside. In Elden Ring, the painted worlds may have been created by specific individuals to preserve something. The fractures at the edges might suggest that the preservation is failing, the paintings are degrading, and whatever was placed inside them for safekeeping is running out of time before the frame gives out entirely. Part 21. The NPC. Who was there before you arrived in the Round Table Hold? There is a specific NPC arrangement that changes between your first visit and subsequent ones. Most players notice the gradual population of the hold as you progress. Characters appear as you advance their quest lines. But there is an NPC who should not be there when you first arrive. Before you have completed the prerequisite steps to make them accessible, a specific figure is visible in the shadow of one of the Round Table Hold's upper-level doorways, not in an accessible area, in a space between rooms that you cannot physically reach, just a figure, standing. The figure is present only during your first or second visit. By the third visit to the Round Table Hold, they are no longer visible in that location. They appear later through their normal quest line in their expected spawn point. This anomaly suggests either an error in the spawn logic, where the character briefly appears before their trigger is properly engaged and the system corrects it, or something more deliberate. The Round Table Hold is described as a space outside the normal flow of time in the lands between, a convergence point where Tarnished from across different timelines and moments can meet. One reading is that the figure in the doorway is not an error, but a bleed-through, another version of the NPC from a slightly different timeline who has already advanced to a position further along, and that the hold's temporal properties briefly allowed you to see them before the game's logic snapped them back to where they belong. Part 22. The Tree Spirits Mourning. Ulcerated. Tree spirits are one of the more distinctive boss enemies in the game. They are massive, writhing masses of golden wood and flesh, screaming through narrow cavern spaces. They appear in several locations throughout the world, often guarding important items or serving as gatekeepers for underground areas. Here is the anomaly. When ulcerated tree spirits die, their death animation ends with the spirit collapsing and then curling inward. The curling is a post-death behaviour that runs after the combat is officially resolved, after your rune acquisition message appears, after the game registers the kill. The spirit physically folds its body around itself. The position it folds into matches approximately the position of a fetus, curled, compressed, with what remains of its limb structures tucked inward. Tree spirits are described as aspects of the Erd tree's life force that became corrupted, or in some cases as the Erd tree's response to death and rot in the world, consuming organic material to feed the tree's growth. If they are extensions of the Erd tree's biology, their death might be processed differently than the death of a discrete creature. The fetal position in death might represent a return posture, a reverting to a primordial state as the animating force of the Erd tree withdraws from the dying vessel. There is something genuinely unnerving about a boss that takes a fetal position as it dies. The game does not comment on this. The animation just runs, and then it is over. Part 23. The Wind That Moves Against the Storm. In Stormhill, the area leading towards Stormvale Castle, there is a persistent weather system. Clouds move in from one direction. The ambient weather effects are consistently directional. This is all standard, but there is a single tree on Stormhill, visible from the main road leading toward the castle, a dead and leafless tree with reaching branches. Every other plant and loose particle in the area moves in accordance with the wind direction coming from the storm. This tree does not. Its branches move in the opposite direction, as if pushed by a wind coming from the castle, rather than toward it. This has been verified across multiple playthroughs. It is consistent and does not change based on time of day or weather intensity. The tree is always moving against the flow of everything around it. Stormvale and the Stormhawk legacy carry a specific set of mythological weights in the game. The Stormhawks were loyal warriors who served the castle, and their memory is tied to the wind itself. Stormhawk Torrent, the spirit ash associated with this lineage, invokes a connection between Eaglehawks and storm weather. One reading of the tree's inverted motion is that it sits at a boundary where the castle's own wind, the wind associated with the Stormhawk legacy and Godric's fractured inheritance of it, pushes outward against the natural storm rolling in. Another reading is simpler, something in the tree's collision with the world geometry, particularly if there is a buried structure beneath it or if it sits at the edge of a load boundary, created an inverted animation artifact. But the consistency is hard to explain purely through technical accident. Part 24. The Prayer Book with the Missing Prayer. Prayer books in Elden Ring expand your available incantations when given to appropriate NPCs. Each book is described as containing a collection of specific prayers or spells, and the game is generally consistent about this. The book's description lists what it contains, and those items become purchasable after you hand the book over. Except for one case, the Gravelstone Seal's associated lore references a prayer book specific to the Farum Azula beast traditions. This prayer book is implied to exist in item text that describes certain dragon incantations as having been learned from recorded prayers in the Beastman's Collected Liturgy. There is a physical prayer book implied to exist somewhere that contains these prayers in written form. No such prayer book exists as a drop or a findable item in the game. The incantations that reference it as a source simply exist as learnable items, but the artifact implied by the lore, the Beastman prayer book, never materializes as a physical object. This is consistent with cut content. It is possible that the prayer book was planned as an item that would unlock dragon incantations through the standard prayer book mechanic, and that the mechanic was bypassed for the final game, with those incantations made available through other means. But the textual ghost of the book remains in the descriptions. The Farum Azula beast clergy is one of the most ancient religious traditions implied in the game's lore, predating the Erdtree's ascendancy. A physical record of their liturgy would be a significant artifact. Its absence may be practical. It might also be intentional, the implication being that the beastman's written prayers were destroyed in the Rune of Death crisis, or in the wars that followed, leaving only the incantations themselves passed down through practice rather than text. Part 25. The moment before the tutorial. Fog Elden Ring's opening is deliberately overwhelming and then deliberately clarifying. You emerge from the coffin in the Cave of Knowledge, fight or flee the grafted scion, die likely, and then begin the proper game in the stranded graveyard. The fog doors and tutorial tombstones guide you through, but in the seconds immediately after you spawn in the stranded graveyard, before you read the first tutorial message, if you turn around and look back at the wall behind your spawn point, there is a fog. Not a fog door, just a thin, atmospheric fog that fills the archway you apparently emerged from. This archway leads nowhere. It is a sealed stone passage. The fog inside it dissipates after roughly 10 seconds of in-game time. The stranded graveyard's lore is minimal by design. It is an introductory space, not a lore-heavy one, but the sealed archway with the fading fog suggests an entrance. You came from somewhere. Where you came from clears away before you can investigate it. The implication most players absorb subconsciously is that you were already travelling before the game began, that your tarnished arrived at the lands between from somewhere, moved through something, and emerged. The fog behind you is the trail of that arrival fading. Within seconds it is gone, and you have no way back. It is a small detail, but the game's opening works partly because it does not explain anything. That archway and its 10 seconds of fog is part of why the world feels older than your presence in it. Part 26. The Fingerprint, Maiden and the Erasure. The Fingerprint. Maiden, also called the Two Fingers, is the medium through which the Greater Will communicates its will to the lands between. She appears in the Round Table Hold as a bandaged figure surrounded by the two fingers. Her lore is connected to the concept of divine guidance and guidance of grace. But there is a specific piece of environmental storytelling that goes largely unexamined. In the Round Table Hold, there are marks on the walls in several rooms. These marks appear to be old burn or scorch patterns. They are faint, visible, if you're looking for them, and present in areas that do not currently have any fire source that would explain them. The burns are concentrated near the room where the Two Fingers and the Fingerprint Maiden reside. The lore of the Round Table Hold does not explain this. No known event in the Hold's history involves fire. The Hold is described as a convergence point outside of normal time, but no destructive event is documented as having occurred there. One possible reading is that the burns predate the current age and are the remnants of the erasure of the Fingerprint Maiden's predecessors. The Greater Will is implied to have used or replaced intermediaries across ages. If a previous vessel or medium was destroyed, the fire that ended them might have left marks, even in a space outside normal time. The Hold's timeless quality might mean that those marks are simply permanent, unable to be undone by the normal passage that would erase them elsewhere. The Fingerprint Maiden's own condition, mute, bandaged, immobile, might be the consequence of proximity to whatever happened there, a figure who survived something her predecessors did not. Part 27. The Ancestor Spirit and its Pre-Death Dialogue. Ancestor spirits are boss enemies encountered in Nocron and in Noxtella. They are enormous spectral deer formed from glowing light and ancient spiritual energy. Their lore connects them to the crucible, the primordial state of life, before the Elden Ring's ordering principle imposed structure on the natural world. The ancestor spirit bosses have no voice dialogue. They do not speak, but players have discovered that in the audio files associated with their attacks, specifically a particular breath-like sound they produce during their charged leap. When slowed down significantly, the audio resolves into something that resembles backward speech. Not clearly articulated words, but the rhythm and cadence of the slowed audio matches phonetic patterns consistent with language. This is the territory where audio analysis gets speculative. Reversed speech in game audio is sometimes deliberate, sometimes an artifact of how sound compression works on certain types of organic audio recordings. The human ear finds patterns in noise, which is a cognitive trait rather than always a reliable indicator of intent. But in the context of the ancestor spirits, whose entire existence connects to something that predates the language and structure of the current world, if they are speaking something, it would not be, in any language, currently recognizable. A pre-crucible utterance would have no modern decoder. The fact that what they say, if they are saying anything at all, cannot be understood may be the point. Part 28. The Site of Grace. That belongs to the wrong region. Sites of grace throughout the game each belong functionally and visually to the region they are placed in. The aesthetic of each grace, the colour temperature of its light, the colour of the grass or stone around it, matches the biome and lore of its location. There is a site of grace in the Altus Plateau near the Erdtree Gazing Hill that does not match. Its light is slightly cooler in temperature than the surrounding graces in the region. The grass around its base has a blue-grey tint rather than the warm gold typical of Altus. The grace itself functions normally, but its visual language is more consistent with Liurnia of the Lakes, the magic-heavy region to the south. This could be a texture assignment error, a small misapplication of the wrong biome's assets to a single grace. That is the technical explanation. But the Altus Plateau is a region defined by its proximity to the Erdtree, its golden light, its elevation. Liurnia's cool blue is tied to the Carian moon magic and the Academy's influence. If a site of grace in the Altus Plateau reads visually as belonging to Liurnia, one possible reading is that the location it sits on was once within the reach of Liurnia's magical traditions before the political and cosmological boundary shifted. The Altus Plateau is accessed by ascending through Liurnia via the Grand Lift of Dectus. Geographically, the boundary between the two regions is a cliff face and a lift. If the grace at the Erdtree Gazing Hill marks a place where the older Liurnian territory extended further east than it currently does, then the cool blue light is the grace remembering a different boundary, one that was drawn before the Academy's influence receded. Part 29. The Erdtree Avatar and the Direction. It faces. Erdtree avatars are large wooden club-wielding guardians that protect minor Erdtrees across the lands between. They are among the most commonly encountered field bosses and are widely treated as straightforward challenges. Here is the anomaly. When you first enter the range of an Erdtree avatar before it detects you, when it is still in its passive pre-aggro state, it is always facing in a specific direction. Not toward the minor Erdtree it guards, not toward the nearest road or player spawn point. Every Erdtree avatar across every location faces east in its default resting orientation. This has been tested across multiple avatars in multiple regions. The starting facing is consistent. East, always east. The sun rises in the east. In the lands between, the Erdtree is roughly central in the world's east-west orientation and slightly north. Morning light comes from the east. The Erdtree's golden glow is frequently associated with morning and dawn in the game's visual design. If the Erdtree avatars are extensions of the Erdtree's will, protecting its smaller nodes across the world, their eastward rest orientation might be them facing toward the source of the greater will's light at its moment of daily renewal. The dawn. When the game begins its day cycle and the light is at its most symbolic, the avatars are already turned toward it. It is one of those details that only emerges if you specifically track the direction multiple enemies face before engaging them, which is not how most players experience the game. But the consistency across all confirmed cases makes it feel like a choice. Part 30. The Dragon Communion and what you actually eat. Dragon Communion incantations are acquired by giving dragon hearts to the Church of Dragon Communion altar. The law is clear: you are consuming something of the dragon, internalizing it, and manifesting its power. The incantations that result breathe fire, breathe frost, manifest dragon eyes on your body. It is a well-established mechanic, but the specifics of what you are consuming have a disturbing detail buried in the item descriptions. The dragon heart, described as the source of the dragon's power, is the organ that contains the remembrance of dragonhood. That phrasing, remembrance, is the same language used elsewhere in the game to describe memories of the greater wills chosen, the memories of the demigods that you collect as remembrances from their boss fights. If a dragon heart is a form of remembrance, then Dragon Communion is not just consuming a power source, it is consuming a memory. The incantation that lets you breathe fire is not a skill you learn. It is a dragon remembering that it could breathe fire, and that remembrance now lives in you. The Dragon Eye incantation, which causes a dragon's eye to manifest on the player's body, is the most visually obvious example of this. The eye that appears is not a new feature your character grows. It is a dragon's eye that remembers being in a dragon. The body part persists because the memory of belonging to a dragon is strong enough to override the normal geometry of a human face. One possible reading of this is that sustained Dragon Communion does not augment you. It gradually replaces you with accumulated dragon remembrances, each communion adding another layer of draconic memory over the human one. The worm god Farum Azula, dragon worshippers who transformed into part dragon forms, may have undergone exactly this process through repeated communion over generations. The anomaly is that the game does not frame this as body horror. It is a magic system. But the law's language, if you read it carefully, suggests that every time you eat a dragon heart, something else is eating you. Part 31. The ghost that sits at the same table. In the Academy of Raya Lucaria, throughout various rooms, there are ghost NPCs, translucent figures replaying old scenes from the Academy's active days. Students walking, sorcerers practicing, figures moving through their old routines. These are well-known environmental storytelling elements. In the library section of the Academy, past the debate parlour site of Grace, there is a long table. Multiple ghosts sit at this table, engaged in their replayed activities. When you enter the room, you can watch them. Here is the anomaly. One ghost at the table does not move. All other ghosts perform their repeated loops, gesturing, reaching, settling into predictable cycles. One ghost, seated at the far end of the table, simply sits. No loop, no animation, just seated, facing the table's centre. Ghost NPCs throughout the game have looping animations by default. This is how the system works. A stationary, non-looping ghost should not exist within the standard framework. And yet this one does. Whoever sat at that table at the end, whatever that person was doing or thinking or waiting for, when the Academy died, or when whatever event the ghost is recreating occurred, their last moment was sitting still. And the game preserved that stillness exactly. Part 32. The land itself. Before the tutorial ends. When you first emerge from the stranded graveyard into open Limgrave, there is a moment, just a few seconds after the emergence, where the game does something it does not do at any other point. The ambient sound dips completely to silence, not to a quiet environmental baseline, but actual silence. No wind, no bird song, no distant water. For approximately 2 seconds, the world makes no sound. This happens consistently. It is not a loading artifact. The frame rate holds, the visuals are stable, and then sound returns. 2 seconds of total silence in an open-world environment is unusual. Game engines fill ambient space by design. Silence is deliberately constructed. If this silence is intentional, it serves as a transition marker. You have left the tutorial, a controlled underground, mechanically guided space, and you're about to enter the world proper. The 2 seconds of silence is the world holding its breath before it shows you what it is. Before the sound of Limgrave returns, the game briefly withholds it, as if to say, this is the last moment before the lands between has any claim on you. What comes next is up to you. It may be a loading artifact, but it happens at exactly the right moment to mean something. Part 33. The Cave of Knowledge and the Inscription that Changes. In the Cave of Knowledge tutorial area, there are several inscribed messages on tombstones and walls guiding new players. These are in-world inscriptions that serve as tutorial text. They are fixed, non-randomized, and placed by the developers as permanent features of the environment. Except one inscription changes. Near the entrance to the fight with the Grafted Scion tutorial encounter, there is a tombstone with text that players have reported reading differently across separate playthroughs on the same account. Not dramatically differently. One player documented the inscription reading, on their first visit, "Seek the grace that guides you." On a subsequent visit to the Cave of Knowledge, through a new Game Plus cycle, the same tombstone read, "The grace has already found you." This is unverified by a controlled test with identical platform, settings, and patch version. It may be a memory error, a misread, or a version difference, but the specific change, from seeking grace to grace having already found you, is consistent with the thematic shift of New Game Plus. By the second cycle, you are not a newly arriving tarnished. You have already been through the whole journey. The grace was always there. And maybe the game knows that. Part 34. Malekith and the Shadow. He does not cast. Malekith the Black Blade is the boss of the Forge of the Giants area, the culmination of the main quest before the endgame transition. He is one of the most visually elaborate bosses in the game, a long dark figure with the Black Blade kindred weapon, and a history tied to Marika and the betrayal at the Rune of Death. Here is the anomaly. In the fight's second phase, when the arena fills with the golden red fire of the Erd trees burning and the lighting shifts dramatically, Malekith casts a shadow. The shadow moves correctly with the light sources during the fight's early moments, but during a specific attack animation, his leaping slam where he descends from a height and strikes the ground, the shadow that falls from him does not land where the physics suggest it should. The shadow arrives at the ground approximately 1 second before Malekith does. This is testable. Pause the game if you can, or slow down footage. The shadow hits the ground, then the body hits the ground. This could be a rendering priority issue, where the shadow system runs on a separate calculation and overruns the character model's physics. That is the technical reading. The lore reading is that Malekith has been described as acting as a shadow himself, as the shadow of Queen Marika, the part of her that carried out what the light of her divinity could not touch. He is, narratively, her shadow-given form. If the shadow hitting before the body is deliberate, it might be the game encoding that identity into the physics of the fight itself. The shadow is Malekith's truest nature. In this one moment, the truest part of him arrives first. Part 35. The Erd tree's roots and the deepest level. The Erd tree's roots extend through much of the game's underground geography. You encounter them in Stormvale's lower reaches, in the subterranean shunning grounds below Leyndell, and in various other underground locations. They are a consistent feature of the world's deep architecture. There is a specific cluster of roots visible from the edge of the deep root depths, the underground area accessed through the subterranean shunning grounds. Below the deep root depths, through a gap in the terrain visible from several vantage points, there is another cluster of roots. Below the deep roots, a layer further down than the named area. You cannot reach this lower layer. There is no path to it. The terrain does not offer a route down, and the space below the deep root depths is not a playable zone. The Erd tree's lore describes its roots as reaching the depths of the crucible, the primordial substrate of the world. The deep root depths is described as being extraordinarily deep, but the visible root cluster below it suggests the game is acknowledging that the deep root depths is not the deepest level. There is more. You cannot go there, but it is there. One possible reading is that the developers rendered the next level of the roots as a visible, unreachable detail, precisely to communicate that the Erd tree goes deeper than the game allows you to follow. The world has a bottom. You are not allowed to see it, but the game shows you the direction of it. Part 36. The butterfly that only appears once. In Liurnia of the Lakes, in the area near the scenic Isle site of Grace, there is a butterfly. Butterflies appear throughout Elden Ring as collectible crafting materials. This specific butterfly, hovering near a half-submerged ruin east of the island, does not respawn. Every other butterfly in the game respawns when you rest at a site of grace. Consumable animals and plants reset with the grace system. This butterfly does not. Collect it once, rest, return, it is gone. Every other butterfly in its spawn group respawns. This one does not. It is possible that its respawn flag was set incorrectly, and it was never meant to be a one-time item. That is the technical explanation. But the Liurnia butterfly specifically, the remed crystal buds nearby, the mixture of submerged and exposed ruins in that area, all of it points to a location that was inhabited and is now half drowned. If the butterfly that does not respawn is intentional, it is the single living thing in that ruined space that exists only once. You find it, you take it, it is gone. Whatever it meant to the place that used to be there does not return. Part 37. The Voice. Behind the Seethe Water River in the Matgelmer area is a river of volcanic liquid flowing through a narrow canyon. The area is hostile, environmental fire damage, hostile enemies, and limited safe footing. Most players move through it quickly. At a specific point in the river, where the flow bends around a rock formation before descending toward the Seethe Water terminus, if you stop and listen, there is a voice. It is not an enemy. It is not a scripted NPC. It is a sound that falls beneath the ambient volcanic roar, but resolves, with careful listening or slowed audio, into what appears to be a repeated vowel sound. Not a word, a sound. The Matgelmir area is associated with the Volcano Manor and the Volcano Manor questline, and through that, with Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. Rykard's lore describes him as having consumed the blasphemous blade, having been eaten in turn by a serpent god, and having merged with that entity, losing himself in the process. Rykard's dialogue in his boss fight, "Let us feast together on the gods themselves," suggests something that is speaking through a body that is no longer entirely its own. The voice behind the Seethe Water, if it is a voice, may be another expression of whatever Rykard merged with. Not the articulate, hungry Rykard of the boss fight, but something older and less organized. The serpent god's deeper resonance threading through the volcanic river that runs through what used to be his domain. Or it is wind and confirmation bias. But it is consistent. It is in the right location. And it sounds, when you're in the right part of the river, like something long and quiet trying to breathe. Part 38. The Shattering's Missing Year. The Shattering is the cataclysmic event that fractured the Elden Ring and plunged the lands between into war. It occurred when Ranni's plot succeeded, and Godwyn the Golden and Ranni herself were killed, or half-killed, by the Rune of Death. This set off a chain of events, including Marika shattering the Elden Ring. The timeline, assembled from item descriptions, NPC dialogues, and environmental details gives a rough sequence of events, but there is a consistent gap in the timeline between the night of the Black Knives, when Godwyn and Rani were attacked, and the shattering itself. No item description or NPC dialogue accounts for what happened in the interval. There are implied events, Marika's grief, the demigod's awareness that the rune of death had been used, the moment when it became clear that the Golden Order's invulnerability had been broken. But the specific sequence of events between the night of the Black Knives and the actual shattering of the Elden Ring, what transpired, who spoke to whom, what decisions were made and by whom, is absent. One reading is that this gap is simply what the available lore does not cover, that the information was never surfaced in item text or dialogue because the developers chose to focus on what came after. Another reading is that the gap is intentional. The moment in which Marika decided to shatter the Elden Ring, rather than allow the greater will to choose a new lord, is described in her boss fight setup as something the greater will could not have anticipated. If there was a period between the night of the Black Knives and the shattering in which Marika was planning, deciding, perhaps communicating with others, or acting in ways the greater will could not observe, that gap might be missing from the record because she erased it. The Golden Order's records were controlled by the Order itself. If Marika did not want anyone to reconstruct exactly what she did or why, certain things simply would not have been written down. The missing year might be missing because someone wanted it missing. Part 39. The last detail about the tarnished you, the player character, are a tarnished, exiled from the lands. Between long ago, called back by grace seeking to become Elden Lord, or to pursue one of the other endings the game offers. This is the frame for the entire experience. Here is something that the game does not draw attention to directly, but that emerges from the item descriptions and NPC dialogue, if you read carefully. The tarnished are described as those who lost the guidance of grace. Grace departed from them. They were exiled, and then the grace returned, calling them back to the lands between. But there is an anomaly in the language used to describe the return. The grace that calls the tarnished back is described as a grace that once was lost, not grace that the tarnished lost, a grace that itself was lost. This distinction changes the reading considerably. If the tarnished lost grace, the exile is their failure, and the return is a second chance. If grace itself was lost, then something happened to the grace system. Something in the Golden Order broke, and in breaking, the old exile's claims were reinstated. One possible reading is that the shattering, the destruction of the Elden Ring restored the grace connection of the tarnished by accident. The grace that marked people as chosen and those as exile was a function of the complete Elden Ring. When it shattered, the categories dissolved. The exile was invalidated not by forgiveness, but by the destruction of the authority that imposed it. That reading makes the tarnished's return not a calling, but a consequence. You are not special. You are a side effect of something breaking. The grace that finds you in Limgrave is not a divine invitation. It is the system failing in a way that opens a door it was supposed to keep shut. Whether that makes your quest more meaningful or less is something the game deliberately does not resolve. You spend the whole journey trying to repair or replace or transcend the very system that sent you away. And whether any ending truly resolves that contradiction is genuinely one possible reading of a game that gives you all the pieces and none of the answers. That is what this video was built around. Not the official version, not the canonical explanation, the gaps, the details, the anomalies that suggest the world is bigger and stranger and more deliberate than the main path lets you believe. Every piece of evidence you heard today points towards something. Not all of it points toward the same place. That is exactly how it was meant to be found. Part 40. The Mimic Tear and What It Copies. That it should not know. The Mimic Tier is one of the most unusual boss encounters in the game. It is a boss that copies you. Your exact loadout, your weapons, your armor, your spells, your flasks. This is the well-documented surface feature. Most players engage it, switch to weak gear before the fight to gimp their copy, and move on. But there is something that the Mimic Tier does that goes beyond equipment copying. Several players have documented that after the boss copies your physical form, it then performs a brief standing animation before engaging you. The animation is not a combat standby. It is a head turn followed by a slow pan around the arena, as though orienting itself, as though taking in its surroundings for the first time. The Mimic Tier is a product of the eternal city of Nokron, which was a civilization that worshipped the Fingerprint Maiden and pursued forbidden cosmologies. The Mimic Tier is described in its item drop as a silver tier, one of the magical liquid entities that permeate the eternal cities. Silver tiers in general are drawn toward life and attempt to imitate it, apparently driven by something that functions like desire. They want to be alive. The Mimic Tier is the most fully realized expression of that want, a silver tier that has achieved a nearly complete copy of a living person. That head turn at the start of the fight, that moment of looking around, is not combat pathfinding. It is a creature that has just become you, looking at a world it is experiencing for the first time with borrowed eyes. It is taking stock. It does not fully understand what it has become or what it is supposed to do with the form it now inhabits. One possible reading of the Mimic Tier's existence as a boss is not that you are fighting an enemy. You are fighting a creature that wanted to be alive so badly that it took your shape and is now confused about what comes next. The aggression follows not from malice but from the only behavioral framework it has available in that moment, which is yours. Part 41. The Abandoned Cave and its two entrances. The Abandoned Cave in Khalid is a dungeon that most players approach from a single known entrance, a cave mouth on the edge of the canyon near the smouldering wall site of Grace. The dungeon connects down into a scarlet rot lake and ends at a boss room. Here is the anomaly. The geometry of the abandoned cave includes a second sealed archway at its far end, past the boss room, that has no corresponding exit in the outdoor terrain above. The archway has a door frame but no door, and the space behind it resolves into plain stone wall with no geometry beyond. Door frames without doors appear in Elden Ring for two primary reasons: cut content, where a passage was planned and removed, and deliberate lore encoding, where a passage was closed off within the fiction of the world. The abandoned cave's second archway is not near any obvious cut content seam. Its position, past the boss room, in the deepest part of the dungeon, places it at the end of the cave's logical progression. The abandoned cave's lore is sparse. It is one of the few named dungeons without a clear historical explanation for its origin or use. The dungeon contains clean rot knights, who were Melinia's personal soldiers, and golden scarabs, suggesting it was at some point under Melinia's domain or influence before the scarlet rot overtook the region. One possible reading is that the second archway was a passage the clean rot knights used as a retreat route, that it was sealed either by the rot or by deliberate action when the region fell, and that no one has entered from that direction since. The passage exists in the architecture. The way through it does not. Part 42. The living jars and the prayers. They say the living jars, the pot-shaped enemies, and also the friendly NPC Alexander, are one of the game's more overtly unusual creature types. They are constructed pottery that houses the remains of fighters, sealed inside and animating the jar as a vessel. The lore is clear about this. Multiple warriors and their power are interred inside each jar, and the jar itself becomes a kind of composite warrior. Here is the anomaly that gets missed. If you observe the hostile jar-type enemies in their passive pre-aggro state, particularly those stationed outside the Jarberg settlement in Leonia, some of them are performing a specific motion with their lids. The lid tilts slightly open, holds and closes again. This cycle repeats roughly every 20 to 30 seconds. This motion has no function in combat. It is not a telegraphed attack. It appears exclusively in the pre-engagement idle state and stops once combat begins. The item descriptions for living jars describe the sealing of a jar as the final act, the moment when the internment is complete. The jar is sealed and the amalgamated spirit is bound. But the description for cracked pots, a separate but related item type, references a belief among jar creators that the interred will seek the sky after transformation. One possible reading of the lid motion is that the jars are trying to open, not to escape, which would be a different kind of desperation, but to commune with the outside. They were sealed away and the world continued, and some part of what is inside them still wants to see it. The lid tilts open just enough to let in light and closes again. It is a gesture of longing that has been worn into an unconscious cycle by repetition over years. Part 43. The Bolt of Gransax and the Angle of Impact. The Bolt of Gransax is one of the most spectacular environmental details in Elden Ring. It is an enormous weapon, larger than any building in the vicinity, embedded in the rampart of Leyndell royal capital. It is one of the few set dressing elements that manages to convey genuine geological scale. The anomaly is in the angle. The Bolt of Gransax is clearly a thrown or launched projectile, given its design as a spear-like object and the surrounding context of ancient dragon Lanciax, the dragon associated with it. But the angle at which it is embedded in the rampart does not correspond to an aerial attack from any realistic trajectory. If you trace the bolt's angle backwards through the air, following its implied entry path, it was not thrown from the sky. It was thrown from the south, at a low, nearly horizontal angle, from somewhere within the city's lower levels, or from the city's southern approach. Dragons in the game, and specifically Lanciax, attack from above, or dive in standard aerial assault patterns. A horizontal throw from ground level would imply either a ground level attack position or a throw from another massive entity with the force to drive a weapon of that size into stone from the side. One possible reading is that the bolt's angle encodes something about the battle's geography that the game does not narrativize, that Lanciax was not flying when she threw it, that she was on the ground, fighting at close range, in a battle fierce enough to bring an ancient dragon down, from the air entirely. The bolt embedded in the wall at that angle is evidence of how close the fighting got, that the ancient dragons did not destroy Leyndell from above. They were in the streets. Part 44. The Dragon in Farum Azula with no name. Farum Azula contains several dragons. The draconic tree sentinel guards an entrance. Beastmen and drakes populate the ruins. The major boss, Makar, is fully characterized, but there is one dragon in Farum Azula that has no name, no item drop that identifies it, and no lore anchor whatsoever. It is visible from the walkways near the Dragon Temple lift. It rests on a ruined platform below the main route. Partially obscured by architecture, wings folded, it does not move, it does not aggro. If you find a way to reach its level, it is technically hostile and will engage, but it does not have a unique encounter frame or any environmental framing suggesting it matters. It is simply there. Farum Azula's dragon population is tied to the Beastman's worship practices and to the pre-Erdtree order that the city represents. The dragon communion law connects consuming dragon hearts to inheriting their memories. Dragons in Farum Azula exist partly as the keepers of ancient knowledge and practice. The unnamed dragon cannot be consumed. It drops nothing relevant. It occupies a specific architectural position in the city that suggests it was placed deliberately, because nothing in Farum Azula's design appears accidental. One possible reading is that this dragon is either the oldest or the last of the original inhabitants, the one that did not become part of the worship structure, the one that simply endured. All the other dragons have been contextualized by the game. the Borealis family in the mountaintops, the ancient dragons in Farum, Lanciax in Lanedell, Grail in the Dragon Barrow. This one was not assigned a context because it predates context. It was there before the city was built around it, and it will be there when the city finally finishes crumbling. Part 45. Morgoth's Crown and the Shape of its Horns. Morgoth the Omen King is the Elden Lord-in-Waiting, the legitimate heir who sat guarding the Erdtree's entrance, while the demigods fought over the world outside. He wears a crown. The crown is distinctive, elaborate, and fits his station as someone who performed the duties of Elden Lord without ever receiving the title. Here is the anomaly. Morgoth is an omen, a being born with cursed horns. He conceals this throughout the game, binding his horns with golden fabric and presenting himself as Margit the Fell Omen in disguise. When his true identity is revealed, his horns are visible. The horns of the Morgoth boss model are a specific shape, curved, large, sweeping back from the temples. Now look at the crown. The crown is not designed to sit flat on a hornless head. Its interior curvature corresponds to the specific horn arrangement of Morgoth's head. The recesses in the crown's interior structure are shaped around where his horns emerge. This means the crown was made for Morgoth specifically, not for a human Elden Lord or for a generic royal. For him, with his horns, as he is. The omen stigma in the Golden Order's world is extreme. Omens are literally sealed in the sewers beneath Lanedell. Considered cursed aberrations, unworthy of grace, Morgoth bound himself and hid what he was while spending his entire existence defending the order that despised him. But someone made him a crown that fits his horns. Someone at some point looked at Morgoth and said, "This is the king." Not despite the horns, with them. The crown exists as evidence of a version of the lands between that briefly believed in him. Whether that version ever came to pass is another question. Part 46. The Frenzied Flame. Seal's temperature. This is a subtle tactile anomaly, documented through the game's controller haptic feedback system, specifically on PlayStation hardware, which uses adaptive triggers and haptic motors to communicate material and texture differences. Most seals in Elden Ring, the catalyst items used for incantations, have warm haptic profiles when held. The Dragon Communion seal has a particular organic texture signal. The Clawmark seal from Gurranq has a rough, solid profile. The Frenzied Flame seal, obtained from Hyetta at the conclusion of her questline, produces a cold haptic response, not neutral, actively cold. The same temperature register is produced by Ghost Flame type sorceries and by items directly associated with Deathroot. The Frenzied Flame and the Deathroot are not narratively connected in any obvious way. One is fire, specifically the fire of chaos and dissolution. The other is the rune of death, the principle that allows true death to exist. They belong to different cosmological strands, but Deathroot's cold and the Frenzied Flame's cold, having the same haptic signature, might be encoding a deeper kinship. Both are concepts that exist in opposition to the Erdtree's warm cycle of rebirth. The Erdtree recycles death into new life. Deathroot circumvents that by enabling true permanent death. The Frenzied Flame dissolves everything, including the cycle itself. They approach the same negation from different directions, and the game's physical feedback system assigns them the same temperature. One possible reading is that the Frenzied Flame, for all its framing as fire, is cold at its core. Not the warmth of creation or even destruction, the cold of something that simply does not care whether anything persists. Part 47. The Bloodhound Knight. Darriwil and the Cage Bloodhound Knight. Darriwil is an optional boss in Limgrave, found in the Forlorn Hound Evergale. Evergales, the green prison circles scattered across the lands between, are described as supernatural binding sites that trap powerful entities. Darriwil is one of the first Evergale bosses most players encounter. The anomaly is in how Darriwil occupies the Evergale space. Other Evergale bosses stand in the centre of the arena, waiting. They are contained, static until provoked. Darrowil is moving when you arrive. He is actively patrolling the perimeter of the binding circle. The patrol is tight, following the edge of the arena in what appears to be a repeated circuit. Two observations follow from this. First, no other Evergale boss patrols. They stand. Darrowil walks. Second, Darrowil's patrol follows the outer boundary, not the interior. He is not pacing around a room. He is pacing the walls of his cage. The Evergale descriptions suggest that some inhabitants were placed there by judgment, and others by force. Darrowil's questline connects him to Blade, specifically to Bled, seeking information about the Rune of Death through Darrowil's known contacts, implying Darrowil had knowledge or connections related to the Knight of the Black Knives. If Darrowil was imprisoned because of his knowledge, rather than purely his violence, his patrolling behaviour takes on a different character. He is not the animal pacing in a zoo. He is a person who knows something, who has been kept from saying it for long enough that the pacing has become reflex. He knows where the walls are. He has traced them so many times the route is memory. He paces because he cannot leave, and he cannot be still. Part 48. The Castle Soul. Soldiers at Nightfall. Castle Soul is in the mountaintops of the Giants, a cold and desolate fortress with a strong contingent of loyal soldier enemies. They are generic in gameplay terms, but follow detailed patrol routes throughout the castle's battlements and interiors. During the daytime in-game cycle, the Castle Soul soldiers move in standard patterns. But during the in-game night, players have documented a specific behaviour in the soldier enemies stationed on the castle's outer walls. Their patrol routes change, not dramatically, but measurably. They shift toward the eastern battlements during the nighttime hours and away from the western side. The western side of Castle Soul faces toward the mountaintops interior, toward the Forge of the Giants and the deep highland terrain. The eastern side faces outward toward the edge of the highlands, toward the Dragon Barrow and the distant sky. No enemy in Castle Soul exhibits direction-specific patrol preferences during the day. The nighttime eastern shift is the only time-dependent positional change in their behaviour. One possible reading involves the Commander Nile questline and his soldiers' loyalty. Nile commanded soldiers who died for him, and their ash spirits serve as his summons in his boss fight. The living soldiers at Castle Soul, who survived the wars that killed their comrades, may have a vestigial behaviour encoded into their patrol logic. At night, when the sky is visible, they face outward rather than inward. They are watching for something that never comes, or keeping watch for something that already passed and left them behind. Part 49. The Radan Festival's Empty Seats. The Festival of Radan, the gathering where champions from across the lands between come to fight the great Radan while he is weakened by the Scarlet Rot, is one of the game's set-piece moments. You arrive at Redmane Castle to find it populated with fighters, each of them there to battle Radan and be killed by him, providing him a worthy feast of combat. The festival grounds include spectator positions, sections of the castle's outer wall and ramparts where NPCs stand watching. Most of these spots are occupied, but in two specific locations, on Redmane's outer wall, there are torches lit and no one standing at them. Lit torches without attendants are a common environmental shorthand for absence in Elden Ring. Fires kept burning are generally kept by someone. These two torches have the same spacing and positioning as the occupied spectator positions nearby, suggesting they were meant to have figures standing at them. The Radan Festival draws warriors from many traditions. Its guest list, assembled from the NPC dialogue and the specific characters who appear, covers most of the major warrior traditions still operating after the Shattering. But there are absences. The Volcano Manor contingent is not there. There is no representative from any Carian tradition. The two empty torch positions may represent those absences made physical, places held for groups that chose not to come, or that could not come, or that the festival's organisers knew would not come. Festivals of this kind, in the game's real-world cultural analogues, always have seats for the absent. Honor positions for those who should be there but are not. One possible reading is that the game rendered those positions as empty specifically because someone who should have been there was not. The torches are burning. The place was set. The person does not come. Part 50. The Second Moon. In Noxtella. Noxtella, Eternal City, is lit by massive golden chandelier-like structures that simulate artificial starlight across the cave ceiling. This is one of the more beautiful environmental details in the game, an underground city that made its own sky. But there is an anomaly in that sky. Among the artificial stars in Noxtella's ceiling, there is one light source that is larger than the others. Not significantly, but measurably. It sits roughly in the center of the artificial sky, and it pulses. The others do not pulse. They emit steady light. This one has a rhythmic brightening that cycles roughly every 8 seconds. Noxtella is described as the city beneath the moon. Its relationship to Ranni's moon is established through the questline. The miniature Ranni doll found here, the silver tear at the Lake of Rot above, the path through Noxtella leading to the baleful shadow, and then to the Astal boss. The entire sequence is a moon pilgrimage. But Noxtella's connection to the moon predates Ranni. The Eternal Cities worshipped the Fingerprint Maiden as a counter to the Greater Will's 2 fingers. Their cosmology involved a different celestial authority than the Erd tree. The moon, in this context, may be a different moon than the one Ranni later adopted as her symbol. The pulsing light in Noxtella's artificial ceiling may be encoding that older moon. Not Ranni's dark moon, which is cold and constant, but the original moon the Nox people venerated before the Greater Will buried them underground. A moon that breathed, that was alive in a way the current celestial order does not allow. One possible reading is that Noxtella's inhabitants built a memory of their lost sky into their artificial one, and the pulsing light is the heart of what they remembered. Part 51. The Godskin Noble's Laughter. Godskin nobles are one of the game's more unsettling enemy types. Large-bodied, pale, wearing the flayed skins of gods as garments, wielding the black flame. They appear in several locations and are widely considered difficult and unpleasant to fight. Here is the anomaly. When a Godskin noble kills the player, before the death screen appears, there is a sound. Not the standard enemy idle sound or the ambient audio of the environment. The noble produces a brief vocalization. Most players miss it because the death screen comes quickly. But if you have audio monitoring tools, or listen carefully in a quiet room during repeated deaths, the sound is identifiable as laughter. It is not the theatrical laugh of a villain. It is quiet, brief, and decays quickly. It sounds like something finding something funny that it was not expecting to find funny. The Godskin Noble's lore describes them as worshippers of the Gloam-eyed Queen, the entity who wielded the Rune of Death before Marika sealed it away. Their black flame incinerates the divine. Their purpose was the killing of gods. The Godskin Apostles are the more ascetic practitioners of this tradition. The nobles are described in their item text as having grown grotesquely comfortable in their role. That quiet laugh when they kill you may be a design choice about what they find amusing. They kill gods, a tarnished who has come all this way, who survived everything before this moment, who was called back by grace and chose to challenge the Order's champions, is, to a Godskin noble, a small thing. They are amused because, from their perspective, the ambition is enormous and the body is very small. And it keeps happening, and they keep winning, and they are used to killing things that were supposed to be unkillable. And you are not that. Part 52. The Fingerprint, Maiden's Bandages. The 2 fingers and the fingerprint Maiden in the Round Table hold are wrapped in bandages. This is consistent across their design. The 2 fingers are completely wrapped. The Fingerprint Maiden, the human vessel that houses and interprets the 2 fingers' guidance, is also heavily bandaged, particularly around her face, eyes and hands. Here is the anomaly. The bandages on the two fingers do not match the bandages on the fingerprint maiden. Not in colour, not in weave pattern, not in how they are applied. The two fingers' bandages are white and appear relatively new. The fingerprint maiden's bandages are yellowed and follow a different wrapping pattern, as if applied by someone else, or at a different time. Bandages appear throughout Elden Ring as a marker of things that need to be contained. The omen-born are wrapped. Certain sacred or cursed artifacts are wrapped. The wrapping indicates something that radiates something it should not. The mismatch between the two fingers' bandages and the fingerprint maidens suggests they were not wrapped at the same time, or for the same reason. The two fingers may have been wrapped by whoever established the current round table hold arrangement. The fingerprint maiden's older yellowed bandages suggest she was wrapped first independently, perhaps before the current two fingers were even in their current form. One possible reading is that the fingerprint maiden predates the current two fingers, that she is not their current interpreter, appointed to serve these particular fingers, but the last surviving interpreter from a previous arrangement, still bandaged for a set of duties that have evolved around her while she remained constant. The fingers changed, she did not. Her bandages remember an older contract. Part 53. The Deathbed Companion and the Warmth Beneath Their Fear, the Deathbed Companion, is an NPC in the Round Table Hold who offers to hold the player character in her arms. Her lore is deeply connected to the concept of death, the rune of death, and the age of the Duskborn ending. Holding her, which she offers freely, applies a small debuff. This is the game's explicit flag: warmth and comfort at a cost. Here is the detail that gets overlooked. After you have been held by fear, and your buff bar shows the negative effect, if you return to her and refuse the embrace, her dialogue changes. She does not become cold or transactional. She becomes concerned. She asks if you're all right. She says she has had the feeling, a feeling like something is wrong with the hold, like it gives more than she intended and takes more than she intended. This line, buried in what many players skip as filler NPC dialogue, is fear acknowledging that the mechanic she is built around is doing something she does not fully understand. She is a deathbed companion, trained to offer comfort at the boundary of death. But the debuff the game applies suggests her embrace does something to the living that it should not, and she can feel the wrongness of it. One possible reading is that Fear's training was designed for those who are dying. Her comfort is calibrated for bodies that are transitioning out of life. When she holds a tarnished, someone who is technically living but who carries the potential for multiple deaths, the calibration is off. She is offering deathbed comfort to someone who is not yet at the deathbed, and the mismatch is what causes the debuff. Her gift is correct, its timing is wrong, and she knows it, which makes the warmth of her embrace more painful to think about. Part 54. The Pot Boy. Questline's unasked question. Jarbairn is the small jar NPC found near Jarburg, Leonia. His questline involves him aspiring to become a potentate, which he has defined as someone who protects others. His questline connects to Alexander, the warrior pot, and results in one of the more melancholy conclusions in the game. The anomaly is in something he says early in the questline, before the events that drive its later stages. During one of the earliest conversations with him, if you exhaust his dialogue past the main story beats, he says something that sits unexplained. There was someone who lived here before the jars. I think they must have been very sad. He does not explain this. You cannot ask him to elaborate. The dialogue branch closes. He returns to his potentate ambitions. Jarburg's history, before the Jar people settled it, is not documented in any item description or NPC dialogue. The Jars chose the area for reasons that are not stated. The location has no obviously distinguishing feature in the current game that would explain why a community of living pots would establish a village there specifically. Jarbairn has no sourced information about the previous inhabitants. He is a small jar who has never left the village, but he has, somehow, a feeling that someone was there before his people, and that they were sad. One possible reading is that Jarban is picking up on something environmental, some quality of the location itself that has persisted through successive inhabitants. Places carry memory in the Elden Ring's world. Grace persists. Wounds in the ground persist. The sadness that Jarban senses may not be a story that was ever told. It may be something the ground still carries from whoever was there before the jars came and made it their home. Part 55. The Gravity Well's Center. Radahn, Star Scourge, is famous for his gravity magic, which he used to hold the stars in place and prevent them from descending on the lands between. His lore makes the celestial mechanics of the game explicit. Stars move, stars have intention, and Radahn spent his life arresting that movement. But there is a specific environmental detail in the Wailing Dunes where Radahn's festival takes place that most players do not examine. At the center of the arena, directly below Radahn's initial position when he charges from the horizon, there is a small depression in the sand. Not a crater, not a gameplay-relevant geometry feature. A slight circular indent in the terrain, roughly 20 feet across. If you stand at the exact center of this depression and drop a consumable, any throwable item, or a simple white soapstone mark, it moves, not dramatically. But there is a very slight drift toward the center of the depression that should not exist on flat sand. Gravity magic is described in the game as the manipulation of gravitational energies derived from the primordial celestial bodies. The Wailing Dunes center point, where Radahn has fought and bled and held the sky in place for years, may have developed its own minor gravitational anomaly, not from Radahn's magic directly, but as a consequence of the accumulated work of holding things in place for so long. The center of the effort has become the center of a very small and very quiet gravity field of its own. One possible reading is that this is the game acknowledging that magic leaves marks, not scorch marks, not visible damage, but a bending of the rules of the space itself at the place where enormous effort was most concentrated. The dunes remember being held. Part 56. The Wandering Merchant's Route. The nomadic merchants scattered across the lands. Between travel. This is established by their name and confirmed by speaking to them. They describe routes, reference other locations, mention distances travelled. They are moving through the world. But their actual movement is extremely limited. They sit in fixed positions. They do not travel in any visible way between player sessions or across in-game time cycles, except one merchant does move. The merchant stationed near the coastal cave in Limgrave, the one near the early road leading south from the first site of Grace, can be found in a slightly different position on the road depending on the time of day. The position variance is small, roughly 10 to 15 feet, and never takes the merchant off the road entirely. But it is measurable with environmental reference points. The merchant does not have a unique dialogue acknowledgement of this. They say the same things regardless of position. The movement is not enough to trigger any known mechanic. One possible reading is that this is simply the only merchant whose patrol was not fully locked before the game shipped. A small movement radius accidentally left active on a single NPC in the final build. That is probably the technical explanation, but the image of a merchant who actually moves, even slightly, even just a few feet along the road in either direction depending on when you find them, has a specific quality that the game's lore supports. These are people who kept going when the world broke around them. Maybe the one near the coast is just the one who cannot quite be still. Part 57. The Stormhawk Ashes and What They Remember. The Stormhawk Dean's Spirit Ash summons a small hawk that attacks by biting and clawing. It is not one of the game's most powerful summons. Most players pass it over for more capable spirits once they become available. But the Stormhawk Dean's item description contains something specific. It says that the hawk yearns to ride the storm wind once more, though the wind has long since died. The wind it refers to is the wind of Stormvale, the Stormhawk legacy associated with Godric's stolen domain. Here is the detail. The ash of Diane remembers a wind that is currently present in the game world. Stormvale still has storms. The wind is blowing when you fight in Stormvale's courtyard. The storm is not gone. If the description says the wind has long since died, and the wind is demonstrably still there, one of two things is happening. Either the description is imprecise, referring to a specific wind associated with the Stormhawk warriors themselves rather than the weather. Or the storm that currently blows through Stormvale is not the original storm that the Hawks flew in. Something about the character of the wind changed. The Stormhawks died or scattered. Godric took Stormvale and brought a new, different chaotic energy to it. The wind that blows now is associated with Godric's failed dominion, not the original Stormhawk covenant. One possible reading is that both things are true. The wind blows, but it is not the right wind. Diane can feel the difference, and the description records her grief at it. She is a hawk who can fly. She cannot fly in the wind that is there, because it is not the wind that she was made to fly in. Those are entirely different things. Part 58, The Silent Twins of Raya Lucaria. In the Academy of Raya Lucaria, in one of the interior courtyards accessible through the main academic route, there are two ghost NPCs who appear together. They stand facing each other. Both perform a loop that involves gesturing, pausing, and beginning again. They're clearly in dialogue in the scene they are replaying. Here is the anomaly. Their gestures do not correspond. A dialogue loop between two figures should have some synchrony. One speaks, the other responds, a back-and-forth structure. These two ghost figures are performing gestures at the same time, rather than in alternation. Both are in the speaking posture simultaneously. Both pause at the same time. Both restart at the same time. They are not replaying a conversation. They are replaying two halves of the same gesture in parallel, as if time has fractured the exchange and collapsed the turn-taking into simultaneity. The Academy's law describes debates and philosophical disputes as formalized practice. The debate parlor is a named location. The Academy encouraged the examination of sorceress theory through structured argument. These two figures may be replaying one of those academic debates, but the synchronized loop, where both speak at once and neither listens, might be encoding the specific failure mode of academic debate taken to an extreme. Two scholars who were both right about something. Two perspectives that were both correct but incompatible. In life, their exchange presumably had order. In the echo that persists, the argument has become two monologues happening simultaneously, forever, in a courtyard where no one learns anything from either of them. Part 59. The Sorcery that Shows the Wrong Star. The glint blade phalanx sorcery conjures a ring of spectral blades above the player's head that fire on enemies. It is a standard mid-tier sorcery with a clean visual effect. Most players learn it as part of their sorcery progression and use it comfortably. But if you cast it and then immediately look upward at the blade's positions against the sky, the blades are oriented toward a specific point in the skybox. Not randomly, they point toward a fixed celestial position that is consistent across all tested locations. The point they orient toward is in the sky above Altus Plateau, not toward the Erd Tree, which dominates that skybox, slightly off from the Erd Tree, toward the northeast. The glint blade sorceries are described as conjuring the light of a glinting star bent to purpose. The blade shape of the light is a refinement of the raw celestial energy, according to the description of the glint blade phalanx. The raw material is starlight. The sorcerer gives it a cutting edge. If the blades orient toward a fixed point in the sky, that point may be the star the sorcery draws from. Not all star-derived sorceries in the game are equal. Some draw from different celestial sources. The glint blade family points towards something in the northeast of the Altus sky. One possible reading involves Renala's moon magic versus Raya Lucaria's general sorcery. If the Academy drew its star-based sorceries from specific, calibrated celestial sources, each sorcery family might have a distinct star. The Glintblade star is in the northeast. Whatever star that is, it has been providing blades to Raya Lucaria sorcerers for as long as the Academy has stood. Part 60. The Golem Archer that aims above you. Golem archers are large stationary enemies positioned throughout the lands between. They fire enormous arrows at long range and are generally treated as environmental hazards to navigate around rather than directly engage. Here is the anomaly. Golem archers, when they target a player at close range, do not track. They fire in a fixed trajectory calibrated for long range. At close range, the arrows pass over a standing player entirely. This is widely known and is the standard tactic for dealing with them. Get close, avoid the arrows, attack the feet. But if you watch where the arrows actually go, they are not fired randomly over your head. They are fired at a consistent elevation above player height. The same elevation every time. And that elevation corresponds roughly to the height of a mounted enemy, a cavalry figure on a horse or a similar creature of that size. The golem archers are calibrated for a different battlefield. They were built to shoot cavalry. The enemies they were designed to counter were mounted warriors approaching from the distance. When unmounted infantry gets close enough, the golems cannot depress their aim enough to hit them. The targeting system does not adjust. One possible reading is that the golem archers predate the shattering by a significant margin, specifically dating from an era when cavalry was a significant military force in the lands between. The golden age of the Golden Order involved mounted knights. The sacred crosses reference knights on horseback extensively. The golem archers were built for that military era, and they are still fighting the enemies they were made to fight. Even though those enemies are gone, they cannot shoot you. They are not shooting at you. They are shooting at the memory of what used to ride at them from the distance. Part 61. The Oracle Envoys Song. Oracle envoys are the small, floating, rotund creatures that carry staves and play music. They appear primarily in Leyendell and in the Erdtree interior during the late game. Their method of attack involves inflating themselves and releasing golden bubbles that deal holy damage. If you stand in a room with Oracle envoys that have not yet detected you and simply listen, they are producing a sound. It is not the combat music or the ambient music of the zone. It is something else. A kind of thin, high, continuous tone that varies very slightly between individual envoys. If you have multiple Oracle envoys in the same area and listen carefully to the harmonic relationship between their individual tones, they are not producing noise independently. They are in harmony. The tones relate to each other in a way consistent with musical intervals rather than random environmental sounds. The Oracle envoys are described as messengers of the greater will, entities that carry and transmit its intentions through the physical world. Their role is communication. The bubbles they breathe out are described as carrying messages encoded in golden light. If they are always producing a harmonic tone, even in idle state, one possible reading is that they are never not transmitting. The song they produce is not a behavioural quirk. It is the message. They are always in the process of saying something, broadcasting the greater will's instructions continuously. What they say is in a frequency range or a language register that mortals cannot understand as content, only as tone. The greater will communicates through the two fingers in symbolic gestures. Maybe those are the words. And the Oracle Envoy's song is the carrier signal, the medium through which the message moves, underneath everything else, always present, heard but not understood. Part 62. The Seedbed Curse and the Count. The Seedbed Curse is a body horror item in Elden Ring. It appears as a small withered fetal form attached to the player character when worn as equipment. It is collected from specific locations and given to Dung Eater as part of his questline. To complete his ending, you need 5 of them. There are exactly 5 obtainable seedbed curses in the base game. Not 6, not more than needed, exactly 5. This precision is unusual. Most quest-relevant collectibles in Elden Ring have at least a small surplus. Cookbook pages come in many more copies than needed. Death roots are collected more than the Gurranq questline technically requires. The game generally ensures that the player does not need to track down every possible specimen of a required item. The Seedbed Curse is the only collectible quest item in the game where the available number exactly matches the required number. You need 5. 5 exist. If you miss one before a questline stage closes off the location, you cannot complete the ending. The Dung Eater's ending, the Blessing of Despair, is the game's darkest conclusion. It is arguably the worst of all available endings in terms of what it does to the world. The Dung Eater wants to curse every living thing and every soul that will ever be born. One possible reading of the exact count is a design philosophy around consent and intent. The game makes you work for this. Every seedbed curse must be found. The ending has exactly as much material as it needs, and no surplus. You cannot stumble into it. You cannot collect passively. You have to want it specifically, and go to each place specifically. The precision of the count is the game ensuring that no one accidentally chooses the worst ending. You have to mean it. Part 63. The Lift of Dectus and its two sides. The Grand Lift of Dectus requires two halves of the Dectus medallion to operate. One half is in Fort Hate, in the east of Limgrave. One half is in Fort Faroth in Caelid. You retrieve both. You can operate the lift. You ascend to the Altus Plateau. Here is the anomaly in how the lift functions. When you activate the lift with the medallion halves and it begins to rise, the animation shows the lift ascending from Liurnia into Altus. Standard. But if you look down from the lift during its ascent, the terrain of Liurnia below does not match the terrain above the lift at its base station. The geography visible from the ascending platform shows a slightly different rock formation than exists at the lift's actual base location when you approach it from the ground. This is almost certainly a rendering artifact where the lift's interior camera loads a different terrain slice than the immediate area. The practical explanation is straightforward, but the Dectus medallion's two halves were separated across the entire map. One is in a dangerous fort far to the east, one is in Caelid, which is hostile territory. The deliberate dispersal of the medallion halves ensures that someone who wants to use the lift must traverse a significant portion of the early world. One possible reading is that the lift itself is the less important part of the story the halves tell. The two forts where they are kept, Fort Hate and Fort Faroth, are both outposts in contested or hostile regions. They were not stored in the nearest safe houses. They were placed in locations that would require effort and danger to reach. Whoever dispersed the halves wanted to ensure that the Altus Plateau was accessible, but not easily. That whoever reached it had already demonstrated they could survive the world below. Part 64. Hugh's Forgotten Face. Hugh, the smith at the Round Table Hold, is chained. He is permanently bound to his forge and cannot leave. His questline involves asking you to help him remember a skill he has forgotten, connected to crafting a weapon to fight a god. Here is the anomaly. Hugh's face, specifically the area around his eyes, shows evidence of healed scarring consistent with burn damage. The same burn damage that the Round Table Hold's walls show in proximity to the Two Fingers chamber. Hugh says he does not know how he came to be chained. He says the hold has always been like this for him, but the scarring on his face is environmental evidence that Hugh was present at whatever created the scorch marks in the walls, not just present in the hold, present at a specific violent event. Hugh is described as a demigod-level smith, a master of weapons. He has been in the Round Table Hold long enough to have forgotten chunks of his history. He is bound there by someone or something and cannot explain the binding's origin. The burn scars on his face and the burn marks on the wall near the Two Fingers chamber create a visual argument that Hugh was involved in whatever happened to the previous fingerprint maiden or her predecessors, not necessarily as a perpetrator. He may have been there when it happened. He may have been bound in the aftermath, as a witness kept close. One possible reading is that Hugh knows something about what happened in that room. The binding is not punishment for a crime. It is a guarantee of silence kept close to the location of the secret. Whether he still remembers what he saw is another question. Part 65. The Erd tree's roots and the direction they grow. The Erd tree's root system is one of the most consistently referenced geographical features in the underground sections of the game. You encounter roots in Stormvale's lower reaches, in the subterranean shunning grounds, in the deep-root depths, and elsewhere. They are structurally enormous and appear throughout the underground world as both scenery and gameplay obstacles. Here is the detail that goes unremarked. The roots do not grow downward. Roots, in the conventional biological sense, grow toward water, toward nutrients, away from light. The Erd tree's roots go everywhere. But if you trace the largest root structures in the deep root depths, the directionality of their growth is not entirely downward or radiating outward. Several major root clusters in the deep root depths appear to be growing upward from below, meeting the downward growth from above. Roots growing from below the Erd tree would imply a root system that originates from something else entirely, something below the Erd tree that is growing toward it. Not the tree feeding downward, but something feeding upward. The deep-root depths contains Fia's questline and culminates in the Lich Dragon Fortisax encounter, connected to Godwyn's death and the spread of the Deathroot curse. Godwyn's body was buried beneath the roots. The death blight that spread from him poisoned the roots above his burial site. One possible reading is that the Erd tree, and whatever is buried beneath it, have been in a symbiotic relationship since before either was comprehensible. The Erd tree grew down. Something below grew up. They met. The current state of the deep-root depths, with Godwyn's deathroot corrupting the meeting point of those two root systems, may be the disruption of a relationship that was very old and not entirely benign before it was poisoned. Part 66. The Commoner Who Preys Among the Ghost. NPC remnants scattered throughout the lands between. There are many types of figures replaying their last moments or their habitual actions. Soldiers fighting, scholars studying, nobles walking. In the Stormhill area, between the Warmaster's shack and the rising road towards Stormvale, there is a ghost of a person in commoner clothing who does something no other ghost does. They are kneeling, facing away from the road, toward the wilderness, and the animation they perform, looped, is clearly a prayer gesture. Hands together, a slight bow forward, a pause, a repetition. Commoner NPCs in Elden Ring do not generally have detailed religious practice animated into their ghost loops. The ghost remnants tend toward action or labour. A commoner kneeling in prayer in a wilderness field, far from any church or altar or site of grace, is unusual. The direction the commoner faces is toward the wilderness, west of Stormhill, not toward Stormvale Castle, not toward the Erd tree. West from Stormhill is the Limgrave coastline and the Weeping Peninsula beyond. One possible reading is that this commoner was a practitioner of a non-Erd tree tradition, a folk religion or an older coastal spirituality that predated the Golden Order's dominance. They are praying to something in the direction of the sea, or to something that was in that direction before the current age reorganized what was sacred and what was not. The ghost preserved their last act of devotion. Whatever they were praying to is not in the game world in any named form,